see the TV guys.
No, I know. Like his help.
Okay,
Technology
ready
challenge.
to go?
Yeah, let me just.
Fire off the mics.
They're on. They're already on.
Okay, I'd like to call a public hearing to order for the Board of Aldermen Budget Committee. It's February 27th, 2017, at 7 p.m. in the Aldermanic Chamber. The clerk would read the, please call a roll.
Yes, sir. Alderman Richard A. Dow, Chair.
Present.
Alderman at Large Lori Wilshire. Here. Alderman at Large Brian S. McCarthy.
Present.
Alderman at Large Michael B. O'Brien.
Present.
Alderman Sean McGinnis, I am here. Alderman Dave Schoneman. Here. And Alderman Ken Siegel.
Present.
And there are no others in attendance other than our audience.
Okay, the public hearing is relative to 017-031, relative to the wastewater system fund as a sewer fund. And I'd like to ask the mayor and the chief financial officer to come up. Corporation Counsel, if you'd like to join us as well. Yeah, that'd be a good place. And whichever wants to start and give an overview, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Why don't I start out, and then where I miss things, if I do, CFO Griffin or Attorney Bolton can fill in. The subject of this is the enterprise fund, the wastewater treatment fund, which from an accounting point of view is handled as a completely standalone fund. But when it comes to the issue of whether it is included in the combined annual municipal budget, is inconsistently, irrationally, and I would say even illegally being handled. So what we have is as I said before, the enterprise fund, which is separately accounted for. Now the city charter provides that there needs to be a combined annual municipal budget. And to some degree, the charter defines what is in that budget, but there's a lack of complete definition within the city charter. So there are a number of things that are part of the city's operations, such as paving and some other things, which are outside and have deemed to be outside the combined annual municipal budget. Paving is one. We have other special revenue funds which are outside the what is considered to be the city budget. And the things that are outside the city budget tend to be user-based systems. For example, the expenditures that are paid via user fees. For example, the paving is outside the city budget because it is funded through a combination of the road aid, which comes from the state of New Hampshire, which is paid for by a gas tax, a user fee, in combination with a flow of revenue from the automobile registrations that the city receives, that revenue, but that's another user-based fee system. Because those sources of revenue are user fees, the paving, the special revenue account for the paving was designated as a special revenue account and taken outside of the combined annual municipal budget. So we look at the sewer user system, which is, again, a completely a user fee-based system, and we see that it is, and there is no, I mean, it either has to be either in the municipal budget or not. And we see a system where it is partially in and partially out. Certain parts of the wastewater treatment enterprise fund are in the combined, are designated by ordinance to be in the combined annual municipal budget. Other parts are designated to be out, even though all is part of the same system and even though all are paid by the same user fees. So I think Mr. Griffin, CFO Griffin, has handed out a copy, just for the committee's convenience, a copy of the pages of the budget that describe the wastewater fund, that give the expenditures for the wastewater fund. And that runs from page 207 to page 211 of the last city budget. This is the last city budget that we passed. Now, if you go to the third page of the handout, which is page 209 of 266, I can show you what I'm talking about in terms of some expenditures being in and some expenditures being out. At the top of page 209 is account 71, equipment, and everything that precedes that line, that account, that 71 two-digit code. In other words, the two preceding pages and the first half of page 209, that is all designated to be within the combined annual municipal budget. But then we go to line or two-digit code 75, where we have 75-100 and 75-200. 75-100, unlike 71, everything up to 71 is within the combined annual municipal budget. Yet 75-100 is out of the budget, the combined, well, when I say the budget, I'm talking about the combined annual municipal budget. 75-2 is out of the budget. The next thing is two-digit code line 81, major capital outlays improvements. 81 now switches the other way and goes back into the combined municipal city budget. Then we go to line 89, or two-digit code 89, interfund transfers out. That particular line is again in. So we have everything up to 71 is in, 75-100 is out, 75-200 is out, 81-200 is in, 89 is out, or excuse me, is in. And then we go to the next page and we see 81-700 infrastructure. Now we go back the other way again, and that is out. So we have this this budget where one line item is in, one line item is out, two line items are in, another line item is out. This makes no rational sense in the sense that because this is a single system, all paid by the same user fees. So in order to straighten this out and provide some rationality to this, we are proposing that the entire enterprise fund be treated consistently and be deemed as a user-based system which is not part of the combined annual municipal budget.
Mr. Griffin, did you want to add anything?
The only thing I'd add is the calculation on the municipal budget is shown also on, I marked the page numbers at the top right, page 4. Start with the total appropriations, subtract the two items that are subtracted being the debt service and the major capital outlay, which results in the slightly more than 9 million is actually in the combined annual budget. Thank you.
And about 9 million is out. So it's sort of, in terms of the total, about half is in and half is out, depending on which line items we're talking about.
So do any of the committee members want to ask any questions for any clarification? Alderman McGinnis?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to understand why the debt service is out. Is that because it's a general obligation of the city? I mean, what is the genesis of that? Why was that out? Why was that principal interest out? I
The,
can understand capital improvements, but
that was
there's
taken
logic
out,
there somewhere back in time.
that was taken out pursuant to an ordinance that was passed in 2007. I think it was 0799. And the basic split was between capital expenditures, at least bonded capital expenditures, which were taken out. Operating costs were left in, and cash capital improvements were left in as well. What I'm saying, and I think Mr. Griffin and Mr. Bolden agree, is that, that there's no legal rationale for that. I mean, either this system is in, this user-based system is in the municipal budget, or it's not. And that there's no justification, either rationally or legally, to say, well, this one is in, this line item is in, and this line item is out.
Any other questions? So if in the end, the action were to put everything in, that's not gonna help us relative to our upcoming budget.
No, it would not.
Alderman Schoneman.
Based on that question, it sounds like the rationale for this has something to do with the overall upcoming budget. Is that true?
Well, I didn't make that speculation, but
But
I
you
just,
s- but
it was
you-
an observation.
It's an observation, but, so then a follow-on observation is that if putting it in would be detrimental, is taking this out somehow an improvement?
Well, can I answer that question? Sir, it does have, the byproduct of this is that it helps the city deal with, first of all, there's precedent for this. The paving, which, yes, is user-based fees, but sort of one step removed, because the money we're getting from the state, I mean, it's not, they got a user fee, but then they collect it and they give it to us. Here, we have a direct user fee. It's not one step removed from a user fee that was paid, not by the state, but by someone else. So in that respect, this is more justified than the paving. But the paving was taken out, and so there's precedent for this. And it does have, in addition to being the right thing to do, providing some rationality to the way this is handled, it does have, in a very difficult year, the benefit of making it could possibly make the municipal budget work under the cap without severe cuts in police, in fire, and in schools.
So the ultimate part of the ordinance, though, is to correct what is considered inequity in the way the funds are handled.
Correct.
I have Alderman Schoneman and then Alderman Siegel.
For clarification, can the mayor or Mr. Griffin just explain how that affects and helps the upcoming budget?
Mr. Griffin?
Certainly. Every year when the Board of Aldermen approves the budget, they approve the combined, by definition, they approve the combined annual budget, which last year was about $263 million. If this particular amount is taken out, you still have the base of $263 million. You don't have the expense of $9 million. The other thing that, being here a little over 6.5 years, one of the reasons why the entire wastewater account, which used to be included in the spending cap, was taken out, is my predecessor's predecessor realized with the consent decrees relative to the wastewater back in 05, 06, that no spending cap index was going to be able to cover the upwards of $70 million worth of capital and associated debt service at that time. So that little bit more clarity, that's what happened when that ordinance that the mayor referenced was put into place. So it took about, at the time, the capital funded by debt and/or user fees, and the debt service funded by user fees. So the combination of those provided some relief back in 05, 06.
Follow up? Alderman Shulman?
Just a question for you, Mr. Chairman, just for clarification's sake. I know we're going to be debating this later. How much would you like me to ask, or now, or ask later?
Just for clarification now, before the public, because we're in the public hearing, so the actual debate on it should come later.
So I may ask a question then?
You can ask a question for
Okay.
clarification, yeah.
And if it's inappropriate, you can tell me. My question then is, the legislation seems to say that this will remove these two lines, capital and debt service, from the spending cap calculation. So it's not going to remove it for fiscal 17. You're saying it's only going to remove it for fiscal 18, the next year. It's not removing it from the base that we're going to be working from this year. And why not?
As Mayor Dorcas indicated, to my knowledge, there's been no adjustment of the base once approved by the Board of Aldermen on an annual basis since the spending cap was put in place. So a budget ebbs and flows. You add services, you take services away. We most recently, the exhibit we have is the paving. We used to fund about $1 million worth of paving within the budget annually. Back, as you recall, a few years ago, we set up the highway fund that's funded by the highway receipts from the state, funded by the gas tax, and $700,000 worth of motor vehicle revenue to provide about $2 million worth of paving. There was no adjustment at that time to the base. That's one example. Other examples are, a small example is when the city stat department was eliminated, there was no adjustment. It's more the ebbs and flows of budget development.
Alderman Siegel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest that the clarification questions be clarification on the legislation, not clarification on what its side effect intentions would be or the thinking behind the intentions. I think that's more appropriate for a committee and a full Board of Aldermen debate. It's my opinion.
Okay. Anyone else? Seeing none, I will now take testimony in favor of 017-031. Please identify yourself.
Hello, Robert Sullivan, 12 Stony Brook Road. I don't know if I'm in favor or not in favor of this piece of legislation, but I have a lot of questions. So do you mind if well, not a lot, I have several. Do you mind if I sit down and ask the questions? Thank you.
At a hearing? Or at the meeting?
Again, if you would just state your opinion on this and not ask questions, because
Mr. Chairperson, this city has always allowed citizens to ask questions pertaining to legislation coming up during a budget hearing. Always. And since, Mr. Chair, you did not pass out pamphlets that everyone internal to city government had viewing of, and there was no PowerPoint presentation to the citizens, I'm going to continue and ask questions pertaining to this specific piece, this ordinance, because I believe there are some errors that were denoted in the Telegraph, and I have put a lot of time going through the accounting of all of this, and it's not my fault that you did not make arrangements to hand out the handouts that everyone else had in here, and maybe that would have eliminated a lot of the questions. So I will proceed
the
and ask.
handouts were given to us just before the public hearing, and there are extra copies if you'd like one.
You are the, don't interrupt me, Mr. Siegel, please. You are the chairperson. I know. You are the chairperson for this committee, and it's always up to the chairperson to make sure that handouts are provided. Also, there's an ordinance that allows citizens to ask questions during budget hearings.
This is a
Not a
public
budget
hearing.
Public hearing, I mean, public hearing. So it won't take long. It'll probably take 2 or 3 times the amount of times I utilized trying to make sure that citizens, because we all want to ensure what Mr. Donchis wants, a transparent government, and not allowing citizens to ask questions during a public hearing, which they have been allowed to in the past, concerns me.
You may ask questions of the mayor and Mr. Griffin.
Thank you. All right. Mr. Mayor, in the Telegraph, it was reported that there may be a $5 million, I have it here somewhere, here it is. Let me see here. It was reported in the Telegraph that this legislation will free up close to $5 million in cap space, potentially avoiding drastic budget cuts to key services. My calculations indicate, and what I have here is the City of Nashua combined budget analysis. I have page 13 of 266. If you move 18 million from the enterprise fund wastewater budget and move it into the exemptions, I believe that will free up a little over 9 million, not 5. Is that correct?
Yeah, excuse me, yes, that's correct.
Okay. So
The
see-
9 million is really the correct number.
Okay, so you see, it does pay to have citizens ask questions. All right, let me go back to my questions then.
Mr. Chairman, just may I note for the record that the handout that Mr. Sullivan was given not only has that, but that is a piece of information that was in our budget book. These pages provided to us by Mr. Griffin are from the budget book, which is publicly available and was publicly available before the meeting. So we have not received information right now that was not publicly available. I just want to make that clear.
Thank you. Mr.
However, I do appreciate that Mr. Sullivan wanted that information, and that's why I gave it to him.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Okay. So there's really $9 million being freed up that could be used over and above what the spending cap allowance would have been if this ordinance is accepted, correct?
Yes, but just because it's available doesn't mean we would use it.
True, I
but-
understand that.
I mean, because the tax rate is still the ultimate constraint, really. And we have the problem of the $2 million that the state has passed along to us. I mean, there is language in the city charter, and this hasn't been interpreted this way up to now, and I'm not saying it should be in a legal sense, but there is, there's reference to mandated costs. And this is a mandated cost, the $2 million, over which we have absolutely no control, and therefore, causes pressure that maybe shouldn't be there, in the sense that, again, we don't have any control over this. Nor do we really have control over any of the expenditures in the wastewater fund. There's a large consent decree, a long-standing consent decree agreement with the EPA, and really there is very little we could do to adjust the operations of the wastewater treatment plant in order to reduce costs without running afoul of a federal court order consent decree that the city entered with the EPA.
Thank you. Thank you. So this piece of legislation, what is the cost of this? The cost to the taxpayers if it's implemented? there was no, in the ordinance itself, the proposed ordinance, there was no financial cost ascertained.
Well, there's no cost.
Okay, so here's maybe a different way of looking at that. If you didn't do this ordinance, then if you were only to go by the spending cap calculation as it would presently be performed without this ordinance, then I think it was about a $3 million increase to the budget that could be, that would be realized if there wasn't an override to the spending cap. And that 3 million comes out to about a 1.5% increase just on the spending cap portion, because, you know, we always hear, well, the spending cap is 1.33%, and yet we get a 2-point-something% increase in our tax bill. So the spending cap isn't the only thing that adds to the property tax bill.
Well, that is correct, but one reason that the taxes sometimes go up more than the budget and the cap is that the state always pushes more costs onto the city, either by withdrawing revenue or pushing costs up. So even though, you know, the common understanding is, well, the city is raising the taxes, it's really the legislature that's raising the taxes, because they do things like tell us that we're going to have to pay $2 million more in revenue, in pension costs, or they reduce education aid by $479,000, or they take away this, or they require us to do that. So the tax rate has a lot to do. And there was a recent article which I will pass out tomorrow night at the Board of Aldermen by, I think he's the town manager from Auburn, but sort of documenting over the last 20 years everything that the state has pushed onto the cities and towns, and it's a lot more than people really remember. I mean, there's so much of it. So anyway, that one factor in the tax rate is, of course, issues that we have no control over that are imposed or in terms of costs or withdrawn in terms of revenues by the legislature in the state of New Hampshire.
So continuing my question here, so if this is implemented then, so if we assume about without this implementation of this ordinance, our tax bills would go up about 2.5%. If, worst case scenario, the total $9 million was used, in addition to the regular spending cap calculation, that would be a 4.5% increase just on that calculation alone to our tax bills. So there is a potential cost to the taxpayers of the city with the implementation of this ordinance. And if you don't use the whole 9 million, then that increase to the taxpayers associated with this piece of legislation is less. But if there is an increase in cost to this ordinance, and I would think that when it comes to cost, the most important cost to be considered is the cost to the taxpayers, the customers who pay the bills to keep the city going. So I'm wondering if really the cost on this ordinance is really zero, and there's some range of maybe, well, if 1% equals 2 million, 1%, and the average bill is $6,000. So the additional cost to the taxpayer will be somewhere, and it's not all the spending cap, will be somewhere between $100 and $200. Is that a fair way of thinking about this, if we want to consider that the taxpayer should be considered when it comes to costs of these pieces of legislation?
No, it is not a fair way, because you posit a set of circumstances that is never going to occur. I mean, neither I will not propose, nor do I suspect the Board of Aldermen would pass a budget that increases operational expenses by $9 million. I mean, you could make it worse if you said, well, if the Board of Aldermen doubled the budget and overrode the cap. I mean, if they did that, yeah, it could double taxes, but that's not going to happen. Nor is it going to happen that this $9 million, that $9 million will be added to the operational costs of city government.
Now, I mentioned 9 million as worst case. I believe, and this is my opinion, that a little bit more will be used, maybe not 9 million, but 2 million. So that 2 million will translate into dollars to the property owner who receives a tax bill. So there is some potential cost of this ordinance to the taxpayer, correct? It could be.
Well,
Additional.
the figure that you've given now, 2 million, is of course corresponds to the 2 million that we've been hit with by the state of New Hampshire. So if the no, wait, if the circumstances that you just proposed came to pass, yes, $2 million would go into the tax base, but that corresponds with the $2 million that we've been hit with by the state of New Hampshire. So in the situation you've just posited, basically the Board of Aldermen in the city aren't really raising taxes any more than the spending cap. It's the state of New Hampshire that's doing it.
But currently, if the spending cap, if this ordinance was not proposed to the Board of Aldermen, the budget would go up approximately $3 million just on the spending cap calculation alone. And that $3 million would have to take care of, I think it was mentioned in the Telegraph article, of that $2 million. So I'm talking about above and beyond that. So the point I'm trying, if this ordinance went in, I'm sure that a little bit more is going to be utilized without asking the Board of Aldermen to override the spending cap.
Mr. Sutherland, I think we keep asking and answering the same question. I know where you're going. First of all, it doesn't appear like anything you've said is in favor of this ordinance, which is.
Well,
where the
I mentioned that
testimony
I
is.
didn't know, I don't know
Okay.
if I
And
if
the
I am.
details that you're talking about will be debated during the budget season when the budget is proposed, if this were to pass.
Okay. Well, why don't I move on to the next question then? So do the wastewater fees paid by the ratepayers also cover the health care and pension costs of the wastewater employees? And are all the employees who work in the wastewater department funded by wastewater fees when these monies are being transferred?
The question is, are the health care and the pension costs included in the wastewater fund?
Yes.
I could probably take that, Mayor. As you would note from the budget, the wastewater fund is a self-contained fund, has revenues that equally expenses, to include salaries and wages, fringe benefits to include FICA, MEDI, pension expense, and other benefits like health care and dental.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So what adjustments to the operating budget will be made due to the transfer of funds? So will the operating budget then be readjusted during FY18, or will that happen in FY19? And how will that, the $9 million, how will that be handled? In other words, accounting principles, if you're going to, for instance, in my spreadsheet here, you're going to take $9 million out of the general fund budget and put it into the exemption portion. That means that the combined annual budget will go down somewhat. How will that be recorded? Will that be recorded next year? And then there will actually be less money the following year after that because of that calculation. How will this be accounted for?
Right now, the accounting for this in the budget would really appear the same, because even though the budget makes it appear that this enterprise fund is all integrated, it really isn't, because half is under the cap, and part of the combined annual municipal budget, and half is not. So really, there wouldn't be a change in the appearance of the budget. It would affect the cap calculation, as Mr. Griffin, the CFO, has suggested.
And how would that be affected? The cap calculation.
I could take a shot at that. Basically, the page that you referenced earlier, page 13, just take out the lines that have wastewater. Take
Okay.
out the positive 18.8 million, take out the two negative offsets that appear on page 4 of the handout that I provided. So essentially, it just doesn't enter into the calculation of the cap.
It would not affect it at all.
Wouldn't affect it in fiscal
subsequent
18.
years.
It wouldn't affect it in 18 for starters.
Okay,
You'd still have, as I mentioned, you'd still have the same base, the 263 million for starters, and then
Right.
you'd move from there.
and how about 19? Would it be affected by the amount, by the operating budget total?
If this particular ordinance is passed, it will never make its way into the calculation, or it would be 18 million in and 18 million out for completeness, as the mayor indicates. We still plan on budgeting this and having it, the appropriations approved by the Board of Aldermen through the budget process.
Thank you. Now, in the Telegraph also, there was mention of commingling of funds. And is there a specific state law that addresses commingling of funds that prompted this legislation?
Now, neither Mr. Griffin nor I actually use the term commingling. That is not a quoted term. I think as a common sense understanding, I think it sort of summarizes, it is not, of course, it's being used by the reporter who's trying to
Okay.
capture the essence of what's going on. That's his term for what we're describing, which is that part of the, even though the enterprise fund appears as a separate and distinct, wholly integrated fund in the budget, it's not in the way that it's handled pursuant to the ordinance. So part of the enterprise fund is within the budget and part of it's not. In trying to describe that, which is not that easy if you're not into this really deeply, I think the reporter thought that that term captures the essence, and from a common sense point of view, it may. But again, that's not a term that we used, and there's no legal, there's no,
It's in the legislation. There it is. In the legislation.
well, it's not a term that I used in the newspaper article, let's put it that
Well,
way,
I would, well, no, but it is mentioned
in the
elsewhere.
ordinance.
So,
And it's in the legislation.
Answer to this.
Why doesn't Mr. Bolton answer that?
State law does require that it be a separate and distinct fund
Mhm.
and not commingled with the general fund balance recovered from taxes. And as far as I know, that's exactly the way it's been being accounted for since its institution. So we're not changing that aspect of things at all.
Okay. See, when I think of an example of commingling, I think about the Social Security Trust Fund being pushed into the general fund, and then it's all mixed and used. In this case, this is a separate entity. It's really not being used for any other purpose. So I would disagree if the concern is commingling a fund. Don't worry, Mrs. Wilshire, you don't have to make faces. I'm almost, yeah, the camera, I hope the camera caught it. You should at least pretend you're interested in listening to citizens. So, but anyway, I just, you can say things.
It is separately accounted for because there is a positive balance in the account. Now, of fairly, meaning the wastewater account, a fairly significant positive balance. Now, the reason for that is that the major capital expenditures that have to be undertaken pursuant to the consent decree still need to be paid for and aren't sufficient given the revenue coming in. But with the positive cash balance in the wastewater fund, that combined with the wastewater fees will cover the capital requirements of the system. But this is separately accounted for. There is no commingling, and all that line says is that we will continue with the practice, basically, of not commingling. This is a separately accounted for fund with a positive balance.
So would you say that the funds are being commingled today?
No, they're not being
Okay.
commingled.
Okay. Okay.
Can I
Let's see.
How many,
clarify-
how
can I
many,
clarify for Mr. Sullivan? I'm just going to read directly from the ordinance with
Thank
the
you.
additional, which is the additional language, which hopefully will provide some clarity. Pursuant to state law, this is the additional lines that were added to the definition. Pursuant to state law, the fund shall be kept as a separate and distinct fund, shall not be commingled with city tax revenues, and shall not be deemed part of the municipality's general fund accumulated surplus. Hopefully that clarifies things.
Somewhat, thank you,
Okay.
thank you. Well, I'm wrapping it up now. How many votes will this take by the Board of Aldermen to pass this ordinance?
Attorney Bolton?
8. Well,
Okay.
a majority of those present and voting on the
Okay,
day
thank
the
you.
vote takes place.
Now, does this ordinance make any changes to the Nashua Charter at all? No? Okay. And Mayor Donches, did you propose this ordinance?
My name's on it, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, was this your idea? Okay. Thank you, but I would like to say that I'm somewhat disappointed, about the handouts. Yeah, okay, Mr. Alderman Siegel, better late than never, so thank you. But, and I'm really concerned, and I don't know if I'm for or against this yet, so I won't be getting up again. But I'm really concerned about some aldermen trying to prevent citizens from asking questions, and that must stop. Thank you.
Any other testimony in favor? Seeing none, testimony in opposition?
My name is Fred Tebow. I have a series of questions, so can I sit down?
Go ahead.
I'm starting to get pretty old here.
And for clarification, you can ask questions. What I was suggesting was the questions go to the people that presented, not to the other aldermen.
Well, my name is Fred Tebow. I reside at 24 Cheyenne Drive, and I'd like to start off by talking about this handout. As I remember, the meeting started as a public hearing, did not start as a committee meeting. That meant that the public handout should be made public. And if you do a handout, a lot of people watching on TV. My wife is watching on TV right now. A lot of people watching on these cameras. They don't see the handout. And even when you say that's part of the budget, I'm familiar with the budget. People are not generally familiar with the budget in detail. They like to see it.
But it's available online. That's my
People
point.
that want, and it wasn't even mentioned it's available online. I know it's available online, but most people don't necessarily look at it online. This is a public hearing, Mr. Chairman. If you have handouts, it's supposed to be presented to the public. I don't even have a copy. Well, I have a copy of it here now. And I notice it's the,
As I stated earlier,
Wastewater.
those handouts were given to us just as the public hearing started. They weren't available before that. So they were given to us by the people making the presentation. And they are pages from public information. They are nothing new.
people don't know that it's nothing new.
Well, since we've said it 3 times, they probably know by now.
And I don't appreciate getting interrupted during the public hearing either, Mr. Alder Siegel. You have plenty of time to discuss this. Now,
Trying to set the
there's an
record straight,
ordinance,
Fred.
528, that deals with public hearings. It says, public can ask questions. Now, you have a very good staff. You got a city attorney, you got a chief financial officer, and you got the mayor, which is a rather heavy-hitting attendance at this committee meeting. So you certainly have people to answer questions. That's good, because your ordinance says you shall have people from the staff or the sponsor or both available to answer questions. And also provide the information to the public that you provide during this public hearing. So it should be presented as a set of view graphs on your projector. So people watching this on TV can see what it is you're talking about. It also said
I think
questions can be
I
answered.
think we can do that now if you want. I mean, I think we can put that up on the screen. I think, aren't you able
I'll
to
come
do
to
that
it in
now?
a minute, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to refer to that budget.
All right.
Now, I said I was opposed. I have a series of questions. First of all, why is it necessary Now, this ordinance is really two parts. It deals with the sewer, establishing a sewer fund in place of the existing enterprise fund that's been around for at least 25 years. And the second part deals with what you've all been talking about, which is the change to the ordinances dealing with what's in and what's out in the combined annual budget. Let me go to the first part first. It's a very simple question. Why do we need to make this change from the wastewater fund to the sewer fund? What prompted this change?
Mayor?
When we were upstairs, and we went through the exercise of looking at, trying to look ahead, seeing what could happen if the $2 million, if we're hit with the $2 million, and at that point we were looking at a 1.2% cap as a possibility. And we're trying to go through the exercise of what would the budgets look like if we had to pass a flat budget for each of the departments. A number of ideas came forward from the public. And one of those was when Mr. Timu, you who have a long-term understanding of this, of the budget, of the cap, of many of the steps that have been taken, both when you were an alderman and since, the paving, you made the statement, why don't you guys come up with something creative like the paving? And that, I think, prompted us to begin thinking of, are there problems, are there issues here in the budget with the definition of the combined annual municipal budget? And as we started to look at it, there were, and this one inconsistency. So in some respects, there was the input at that meeting that prompted us to begin looking at these definitions more carefully.
So the purpose for the sewer fund is really to back into a way to get around the spending cap?
Well, I don't know what the purpose of, only you proposed when you were an alderman this split system of putting part of this in, part of the wastewater fund into the combined annual municipal budget and part of it without. Now, I don't know what the rationale for that was. But looking back at it now, it doesn't seem like a rational approach because this is a unified, user-based system that is subject to federal mandate, where we are responding basically to not only to the desire to clean the water, but also a specific federal mandate expressed in a consent decree court order with the federal government. And so I don't know what the rationale was for dividing the system, but I have trouble figuring out how that was justified legally or rationally. And as we looked at it, it really is one system, user-based, and it really needs to be handled as a whole, not divided as it was done back in 2007.
Let me, it's interesting you bring up this 2007 ordinance, because I looked it up.
I think that's when it is, wasn't it?
It's one of those ordinances. I was not the sponsor of that ordinance. Alderman Dean was the sponsor of that ordinance. Our city attorney, who's now city attorney, at that time was an alderman, voted against it. Alderman McCarthy, who's then Alderman McCarthy, voted against it.
Well,
And they pointed out
I think
to-
the city attorney actually questioned its legality.
And they questioned the legality. I can't recall my own discussion. I do remember there was a big issue about the combined sewer overflow federal mandate being a $60 million elephant facing the city. But the point of it is, as you pointed out, and I'll quote you, you said earlier in the meeting, this is irrationally handled. I couldn't agree with you more. What's in and what's out. If you decide what's in and what's out, you go back to the charter. Because you, Mayor, yourself, not long ago, in another attempt to get around the spending cap, with the mandates, you said an ordinance can never supersede a charter. So I will go back to the charter, of which I happen to have a copy. 56C. Now, 56C tells you what's in the budget. What's in the budget is everything prepared by departments, not things that are not prepared by departments and voted on by the aldermen. Grants are not prepared by departments. Combined, overlay account is not prepared by departments. What's prepared by departments, what's in the budget is what's defined to be prepared by the departments of the city, and it says so right in 56C. And interestingly enough, there is no exception to anything in 56C. Now, all this stuff has gone to the Supreme Court of New Hampshire. I was part of that. Supreme Court of New Hampshire had some technical issues that had nothing to do with the constitutionality of the spending cap or tax cap. And in 2011, I think it's 2010, 2011, tax caps and spending caps were legitimized not only for cities, but for towns. It said in that state law that if cities or towns wanted to enumerate exceptions, they would have to state so in their spending cap or tax cap version. If they wanted to put a special revenue in for exception, a capital reserve fund in for exception, what they call a dedicated fund, even though I'm not quite sure what that means for exception, that had to be stated. It also said in state law, I don't want to quote you all the details, but I certainly will if it comes to that, that the city of Nashua was grandfathered, just like the city of Manchester with its spending, its tax cap was grandfathered, just like the city of Dover, I believe, grandfathered. So our cap is not a tax cap. Our cap is a spending cap. It says the city shall prepare budgets for each of their departments. That's an appropriations type budget. It's a spending. It doesn't say the taxes. And the reason for that is taxes are very difficult to determine. So there are no exceptions.
Now, can I respond to that? Did you?
Absolutely.
Now, I mean, the language isn't that great. It's not that clear. But 56C does list a bunch of departments that are under the combined annual municipal budget. It
Yes.
lists the mayor's office, the aldermanic office, the legal department, administrative services division, community service division, and on and on and on. One thing it does not mention is the wastewater treatment fund, enterprise fund, which was in existence at the time the cap passed. So it does not include the wastewater fund in the list of things that should be under the combined annual municipal budget. Again, it is not a model of clarity, but in reading that, I think you can infer from that that the intention was that the wastewater fund not be included, like all the other actually operational departments of the city which are listed there.
Mr. Mayor, I knew you'd bring that up.
Well, you're always but you're always one step ahead of me, Fred. So.
You've been a mayor many years. Who prepares the budget for the wastewater system?
You're going to say Public Works, but it doesn't have to be that way. There's no requirement.
Who's doing it?
Who does it? Probably the people at the wastewater plant.
Are they part of Public Works?
They are, but they're not required to be. There's no requirement of the city charter that they be under Public Works.
Listen, just who is preparing a simple question without the dates to this, that? Who is preparing the budget for the wastewater
I think the
treatment system?
wastewater, I think the people at wastewater prepare it. The superintendent of the wastewater budget.
Are they part of the public works?
Excuse me, of the superintendent of the sewage treatment plant and the wastewater system.
Are they part of public works?
Right now they are, yes.
Absolutely, I rest my case on that one. So, there's a couple of ways to deal with the budget. One of them is what they call the exemption provision. It's a vote of 2/3. So if you don't like the budget, you take a 2/3 vote.
Mr. Chairman, I understand this is public hearing, and Mr. T-Boom has some points, but can we keep the commentary to the legislation that the public hearing refers to?
That's
The legislation. The legislation is about that, not about how the cap mechanics, okay? We're about the legislation.
Mr. Siegel, if you look at number
It's
2.
Alderman Siegel, thank you. You can
Siegel,
demote
if you
me at
look-
another time.
Alderman Siegel, if you look at item number 2 in the proposed ordinance, what do you see?
Mr. T-Boom, I have personally no problem with you, and I'm not the chairman. I don't, you can give all the testimony you want. All I'm saying is just make it germane to the legislation.
And it is. We're talking about
Tebow.
the second part of the ordinance.
We've given you and others a lot of leeway, which is fine. But please restrict your questions to the people that presented, the mayor or Mr. Griffin, or the corporation council, and not the other aldermen.
Mr. Chairman, please refrain your members of your committee from interrupting. Now, let me go on. Clearly, you can either meet the combined annual budget, or you can take the exception, 2/3 vote. But you cannot write an ordinance that takes an exception to the charter. You yourself said that, and certainly Alderman Bolden would agree with that.
Well, I don't know that I would.
Bolden, I should have said City Attorney Bolden. So that's where we are. So that's number 2. There's a statement in the ordinance on item number 2 that talks about even both are fully funded through sewer user fees. If you look at the budget, and in fact, the one you handed out, that people didn't see, you'll find that the sewer user fees add to $12.8 million out of the $18.4 million. It's sewer user fees. If you wish, you can bring it up on the screen. I can point it out to you. If you don't want to do that, we can just go on. Only 68% are covered by the sewer user fee. Perhaps CFO Griffin can address this question. And I'll refer you to page 203 of the budget book. I'll go there with you.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask a question of the speaker?
President McCarthy?
It's your opinion that we can't make changes to what's in and what's out by ordinance?
Absolutely. You cannot make changes what's in, what's out by ordinance when the charter tells you how to prepare the budget.
The section that makes the changes did not originate with the ordinance in 2007. It originates with ordinance 9476, which is, if I recall correctly, was authored and sponsored by you. That ordinance is in fact cited in an amicus brief that you filed on the case against the Manchester spending cap. And in that brief, it says that the Board of Aldermen has, without challenge, ruled what is and is not in the cap by ordinance. Which is it?
I don't, the amicus brief you're talking about, I talked about what's in and what's out. You want to make that available? That's certainly news to me.
You talk about the fact that the contents has been amended by ordinance. And it cites, in fact, the set of ordinances which were implemented in 1994.
Now I know what you're talking about, and that's another problem. In 1994, when there was some debate, what is a combined annual budget? It's a new term.
Oh, I got it.
Alderman didn't know what it meant. I helped enact an ordinance, and I put precise numbers and account numbers. As an example, capital projects was account number 700. Capital projects are not appropriated by the Board of Aldermen. Board of Aldermen appropriates funding for capital projects, and then they're given their own accounting system called 700s. So you wouldn't mix up what's in a project to be done with the funding for that project was separately appropriated, maybe in previous years. In a later ordinance, after I was through being alderman, all the account numbers were taken out. And no identification exactly what an overlay account would be and its number, what a capital account would be and its number. A slew of other numbers were taken out, and it completely confused the entire issue of what I tried to do in very precise and engineer. I'm an engineer in a very engineering manner, try to say what's in, consistent with the charter, and prepared by department, mostly 300 accounts, and what's not in. And by taking these account numbers out, Alderman McCarthy, everything got confused. It's a pattern of abuse of the system, in my opinion, because aldermen have control over ordinances, and people like me, I'd have to watch this like a hawk, whether you're an alderman or not, or you lose track. Our spending cap is 23 years old. Many of the people that originally pushed it have died. I'm still around. My hair used to be dark when I first started this thing. I'm trying to keep track of it. I can't keep track of people take account numbers out to give precise definitions what's in and what's out. And if I quoted that to the Supreme Court, then I was quoting that ordinance with its numbers at that time still in existence. Now let me go on to my next question. Why does it say mostly user fees when 68% of the fees are really paid with user fees? The remainder are not user fees.
Mayor?
Well, yes, they are. I mean, it either, the reason that the figure is, we'd have to go into the detail, but the reason that the figure is less, the 66% is because some of it is bonded. And number two, because there's a surplus of user fees sitting in the account, and that is drawn upon to some degree. So all of the money in the system is user fee. There's no tax money going in there at all. Now, we might not be appropriating, we might be using some of the surplus user fees that have been accumulated to do capital projects, and we might be bonding some things, but all of the expenditures made out of that account are derived from the user fees. No
Maybe you can
tax
explain
money
this,
at
Mr.
all.
Maybe you can explain this, Mayor Donches.
And if I'm wrong
an
about that,
item
Mr.
called-
Griffin can correct that.
Wastewater net assets, what are those?
Mr. Griffin?
And that represents, by the way, 28.5% of the $18.5 million.
Let me start this way. The fund is self-contained. It's reported on our CAFR as a self-contained fund, meaning it has its own balance sheet, income statement, et cetera. As of this past June, the unrestricted net assets are about 12 million. So prior year, the number was more like 14 million. What we try to show when we ever come in for a rate increase for this particular fund, we show the ebbs and flows of the balance of the unrestricted net assets. The unrestricted net assets are designed to do a few things. Most importantly, fund the wastewater equipment reserve fund. So when we need to true up, if that's the right word, the expenses with the revenue, you have to draw down on unrestricted net assets, or you bond, or take out an SRF loan.
Okay, so as I understand it, the wastewater net assets are drawn from the reserve fund. Are those user fees?
Combination of excess user fees overspend to the extent the user fees are greater than the operating and maintenance costs, or debt.
So
You
not
borrow, if you recall, and this was an important step for the city, we bonded, took out a loan for about 2/3 of the wet weather facility. We decided a few years ago to bond the remaining 12 million. That had an immediate positive impact on unrestricted net assets. So it's the combination of any excess revenues over expenses plus debt.
So it's not all user fees in this account.
One final point, great question. It's going to be paid for user fees through the rate increases.
Yeah, but
That's-
I'm
that's
talking
how
about
the system works.
Wastewater net asset.
But at some point in time, and Board of Aldermen has presided over a few rate increases since I've been here, and they'll preside over a few more, because when we borrowed the 65 million for the CSO projects, we now have to pay that back through debt service.
Yes,
And in order to
okay.
fund the debt service, we need to have increases in the rates.
But there's money borrowed to fund the improvements to the wastewater treatment plant, but all payments on the debt the debt is paid back exclusively by user fees, interest and principal. So it's all a user-based fee system,
Unless you-
self-contained.
Unless you pull it out of reserve fund, like what you do with the wastewater net assets.
But the reserve fund is part of the wastewater fund. That reserve fund is excess user fees. Is it? Yes. There's
Is-
never been tax money pushed into this fund.
CFO Griffin, the money is pulled out of the reserve fund. You call wastewater net assets to true up the whole and balance out the whole equation of the 18.4 million. The revenue equals 18.4 million expenses. That's how you do it with this account. Is that all user fees?
As I indicated, it's 100% user fee based. In addition, any debt that's borrowed goes into that position in advance of the usage of the net assets. So as the mayor said, what I'm saying is at some point, all of the debt service is paid for by user fees. It's just a timing issue.
Well, let me go on because
I mean, it's an important point because there is no other funds other than the minor permit fees and other towns that contribute through their user fees. It's a very important point.
I think I understand it now. I think the write-up for the analysis is not quite accurate. Let me go on. If the wording in the analysis should not be subjected to 56C in the budget increases, it use the word should be. That's my point. If you got things in and you got things out, the wording shouldn't be should be. It should all be in because of the charter language. Mayor Dodges, you made a decision. Should it be in or should it be out? You call it irrationally handled. It should therefore say, oh, it should all be out. And I'm saying to you, no, sir. It's irrationally handled. It should all be in. And I back to use the charter for the argument.
We agree that the current system is irrational.
Right.
So the question is, what should the Board of Aldermen do about it to correct it? And I'm saying that we should pass this ordinance and make it a self-contained, segregated, user-based system.
And if the aldermen decide that it's all out, all exempted, the entire 18.4 million exempted, then we have an issue about whether that violates the charter. And we'll have to take that outside the Board of Aldermen. Let me go to the next question. If you take out $18.4 million of the budget, you're left with $18.4 million less in the combined annual budget. I think a point that Senator Sullivan made. However, depends how you treat it. Now, I understand you to say that if you take the $18.4 million out, comparing it to the next fiscal year, you're comparing a budget that's about $9 million less than before. You're comparing that with the budget that is about $9 million more. And you're not comparing apples and oranges any longer. So I'm not totally sure I understand this analysis of having this gap. That's in the newspaper.
Well, first of all, the fund is expending $18 million, including capital and operations. But it's not correct that this takes $18 million out of the combined annual municipal budget, because by ordinance, half of it is already out and half of it is in. So the net is 9. But what we agree upon is that whatever was done, I guess, when you proposed it, or whoever back in '94, or someone else did, and I've not researched the history of exactly how this got this way, but when that was done, there was no rational basis for that, half in and half out. And we're proposing that we make a correction now, that we make a correction now.
I don't
The
understand.
system rational.
That was not my question. My question was, what is all in, what is allowed? You look at the equation that's also mentioned, the combined annual budget equation, the calculation. That came around, it's known as I sponsored, because I got confused about how the whole thing got calculated in around 2000, in around 1994, frankly. And this ordinance passed, I believe, in 2006, and we come up with this very nice equation. The public can see it. It's on page 11 of the book. There it is. Now, if you take out all the 18 million, the combined annual budget will shrink by $9 million, because it's half is in, half is out. So now you have 257 million. Are you now going to compare 257 million with the 260 million that's in with the 257 million with the 263 million? Or are you going to compare 257 million with 257 million as a baseline? Because if you're not, you're comparing apples and oranges.
I mean, I will let the CFO and the lawyers answer that more completely, but the simple answer is we're handling it the way this type of thing has always been handled in the past. We're handling it the same way that
right.
it was handled when the
Okay.
paving was taken out, which you supported, and you supported the way it was handled. We're handling it the same way it was at that time. And the same way it's been handled all the previous times when something like this has occurred.
The Corporation Council would like to make a,
Yeah. Well, that's the way it's always been handled in the past, without response to amend the spending cap or anything else. But even more important, I think, is that the budget resolution passed each year says what the combined annual municipal budget amount is. And we go by that when we start preparing the next year's budget amount.
Okay, so by that definition, the combined annual budget is what it is when it gets adopted.
Right.
Okay. It's a fair. This went in effect, and this method went in effect around 2010. I'm sorry, 2007 or 2008. Before that, there was no calculation. But that's fair. I'll accept what you said, because that's set the stage for what is the combined annual budget. They said it's adopted, so that's it. But that creates a $9 million gap. But let's take it the year following the year. Now your combined annual budget is whatever you have adopted at that point, and you no longer have your advantage of now having this big exemption. Now what happens? All your other budgets have now shrunk. And the amount of room for all of the other departments to now expand is now limited, because the amount of money underneath the combined annual budget is now lowered by about $9 million. Is that fair? Does that make sense? You look puzzled. You don't understand that point?
I don't understand your rationale. Our budget next year will be whatever the Board of Aldermen passes.
Right.
If it's more than this year's budget, it will be more going forward. If it's less than this year's budget, it will be less going forward.
But the year after that,
It will
Now
be
you-
whatever it is.
Yeah, the overall amount is shrunk because you're taking out an $18 million, or at this point, a $9 million part that's part of the budget. You've taken that out. So the total amount that you're now working with as an expansion under the cap,
Well, the wastewater will
limited.
be separate. So we're not going to be
that's right.
showing that in the budget, assuming this passes going forward. So I don't think the amount left over in other departments changes in those other departments.
Because you can't adjust one versus the other.
President McCarthy?
I think we all understand that to be the case. I mean, what'll happen is next year, the allowable number under the cap, based on what was the base this year, will be large. We will adopt a budget that is some $9 million less than that because it no longer includes in the budget some of the expenses that are currently in the budget under the wastewater system. So the base budget the year after that will be set by what the budget process will be. It will be less than what the cap would have allowed next year unless we were to appropriate an additional $9 million, which seems unlikely. I
Exactly.
think we all understand that.
Exactly.
The point that may be brought up is that the CPI growth on the $9 million will not appear in the cap calculation in the 2019 budget. Neither will the increase in expenses in the wastewater fund, and the wastewater fund has not been kind at giving anything back to what could go in the rest of the budget.
Exactly. That's my point. Well, in summary, irrationally handled, I agree with. Abused, I agree with. A pattern of changing and rechanging what I had initially started back in, I think, 1994, is a law of unintended consequences. You try to set something up with account numbers and being strict about it, and next thing you know, people remove the account numbers, and then other changes and other changes. We got to put a stop to it. We either adhere with the charter or we don't. It's up to the alderman to decide, does this meet the charter? It's my opinion, and I've been taking a lot of time here, that it's not. It's inconsistent with the charter. If the alderman vote to take all that $18 million out, then we have to decide, do we let it go or not? I met with Attorney Clark, and I met with the mayor. The mayor has always been very kind to me and met with me when I was asked. And Attorney Clark is Attorney Clark. You know, terrific. Attorney Bolton wouldn't meet with me. I'm not sure he was in or not.
I would have met with you. I've met with you every time you've asked.
All right, you weren't there that day. And we all concluded. I concluded Attorney Clark. If it's all is irrationally handled, we didn't use that terminology, but it's either all in or it's all out. We got to stop this nonsense of playing games with this ordinance, 5145. It's quoted in this ordinance. There's no exceptions allowed in 56C. If you want to have a budget, if you can't stand having this $23 million retirement fund happen on you, I got 10% thrown on us as a mandate. And yet you have all the other expenses. The way to handle this is 2/3 vote override. That's the way it's set up. That's the legitimate way to do it. No playing around with ordinances. No little dog called the sewer fund being wagged by this huge tail called the spending cap. Doesn't apply. Thank you very much for taking all the time to listen to me, Mr.
No problem.
Mayor Chapman.
Okay. Any other testimony in favor?
That was in favor.
Seeing none? Any other testimony in opposition? Seeing none, I will declare the public hearing closed at 8:19 PM. And then we will open the regular budget meeting. For the clerk, please call the roll.
Yes, sir. Alderman Richard A. Dowd?
Present.
Alderman at-large Lori Wilshire. Alderman at-large Brian S. McCarthy. Alderman at-large Brian B. O'Brien.
Present.
Michael B. O'Brien, Sean McGinnis, I am here. Alderman David Shoneman. And Alderman Ken Siegel.
Present.
Okay, all present. Public comment?
Mr. Chair?
Oh,
Um,
yes, Mayor?
I think I've answered all questions. If any committee members have questions for me that they haven't already asked, I'd be glad to answer them, but otherwise I guess my inclination would be just to let the committee discuss it. You know, I don't really have any more particular input unless you have questions.
Does anyone on the committee have a question of the mayor or corporation counsel? Excuse me, comptroller?
Mr. Chairman?
Alderman Shoneman?
I do have a question regarding the comments that were made about handling these kinds of things consistently. My concern, and if you're going to be leaving, I'll just ask the question. When we looked at, and maybe you can tell me why this is different, if it is. A couple years ago, when we had an emergency request for a new police generator, it was $500,000. We voted that in, and that basically retroactively was a supplemental appropriation. It changed the previous year's spend in order to give us more headroom under the cap. That was, I think, the reasoning behind that. So if in one case we change the previous year's spend, but in this case we don't change the previous year's spend, where is the consistency? Or what am I misunderstanding?
I could
Mr. Griffin?
Probably take that. At that point in time, we actually had that amount left under the cap. As you know, the last two budgets that the Board of Aldermen's approved were leaving like 100,000 at best, and sometimes we use it. Most recently, you approved a $10,000 supplemental appropriation that essentially gets added to the prior year base. It doesn't adjust it negatively. So in the case of the generator at the police department, it made good sense to use the remaining amount under the cap for that purpose. And then you just add it, so you've essentially used all of the available cap space. This is a case where you're taking something out. I mentioned, the mayor mentioned the paving. I mentioned certain departments that have come and gone. There's never any, as Attorney Bolton indicated, to my knowledge, there's never been an adjustment negatively for something that's already been approved by the Board of Aldermen.
All set?
Yep, my opinion doesn't change, but yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
President McCarthy?
Yeah, I have if the mayor's planning to leave, I had a separate question that's actually not related to this ordinance, which is, we have an item tabled in committee, which is the appropriation to Harbor Homes.
Yes.
There was some question about whether the number of 20,000 was correct. Is it your opinion we should move that forward with that number?
I think we should continue to wait and see
Okay.
how things progress. You know, they do have a shortage, but they're raising some money. They raised 20,000 plus at the pancake breakfast the other day. There are other efforts to raise money. More people are showing up than we thought. So I think we should let the program continue to develop experience for a while more.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Public comment.
I'll wait for the public comment in case I get any more questions.
Hello, Robert Sullivan, 12 Stony Brook Road. Tonight, I believe the Budget Committee will be working on 017-031. I'm against this ordinance. In my opinion, I believe this is in part a way to get more monies based on the spending cap law. I believe, you know, in the last year, and Mayor Donchis, I know you come across as open and transparent, and I believe you are. You've always been. But in the last year, there have been 4 attempts to sort of do an end around to the spending cap law. We had unfunded mandates. It was being considered to take those out of the budget in order to get more monies. We had, I believe, an ordinance for a pension fund of 1.2 million funds, and that was defeated by the Board of Aldermen. And I believe that just recently, that $900,000 was put aside for the pension funds. That's the third, and I believe that this may be, although I really don't know for sure, but that could be number 4. So I'm against this. I think it behooves the Board of Aldermen, if they don't think that there's enough money being funded in the mayor's budget, that they override the spending cap. And that's been, I believe that there's these end-arounds, as other citizens call it, have been pretty evident, either attempted or implemented. Now, I want to share a concern. I don't appreciate being interrupted when I'm speaking. And I've noticed, and I don't watch the meetings that much anymore, but I notice aldermen making faces at citizens when they speak. I find it so unprofessional, so unprofessional. And it continues. It continues. And so, Alderman McCarthy, I would hope that you would take my observation to heart, and please, I think you know who I'm talking about, and if you could just address it, it would be appreciated. And Mayor Donches, I do believe that you strive to be open and transparent. If you could in the future, I think that this ordinance is so important, is more important than most of the others that go through. If you could make sure that a PowerPoint presentation is provided to the citizens, because, even though one alderman said, well, it's in the budget book, look, do you think the people listening are going to run to their budget books and start looking at the numbers? And that's what was mentioned at just the public hearing that we just had. Do you really think that that's what publicly elected officials are supposed to do? They're supposed to inform the public as to what's going on. And to expect citizens to have budget books, and I know you folks, most of you have those. I know Alderman Siegel does, Schoeneman, McCarthy, just about all the, but you can't expect people watching, oh, honey, go run for the budget book. They're talking about line item, blah, blah, blah. We should have that. Make sure that the presentation is simple enough so that the citizens can understand it. And I've seen this done before. It's not too much to ask. And thank you for, have a good evening.
Okay. Alderman McGinnis?
Communications,
Yes.
there are none.
Okay.
Unfinished business, I'm sorry.
Can I make a motion to suspend the rules such that a communication received after the agenda was prepared can be accepted?
Sure.
I'm making that motion.
All right. Motion on the floor is to so far suspend the rules as to allow for the introduction of a communication received after the beginning of the meeting and be made part of the records. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All set, Alderman Siegel?
Oh, I'd like to make a further motion to accept the communication received at the start of the meeting from CFO Griffin, which is the budget book pages that were referred to during the public comment.
The motion on the floor is to accept the presentation from the paper presentation from CFO Griffin. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Alderman Siegel, all set?
That's all I wanted to make sure we had this, so there was no confusion. Thank you.
Excellent. Unfinished business?
There is none.
New business resolutions?
Not aware of any, there is none.
New business ordinances?
Yes, so we have a new ordinance, 17-031, relative to wastewater system fund as a sewer fund. Excuse me.
Do I hear a motion? Alderman Siegel.
To make a motion for final passage of 017-031.
The motion on the floor is to recommend to the full board final passage of 017-031. Discussion? Alderman Siegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the public comment. I'm sorry that the perception was that we weren't listening, because I certainly was listening. Whether I liked hearing some of it or not, I was certainly listening. I would point out that what is being done here is no different than the paving fund. It's exactly the same thing. In fact, the DPW sets the paving budget also, I might point out. And so this is merely, and there is a legitimate question. There's a problem with the straddling of expenses. Do you say, let's put them all in, or do we want to take them all out? I think if we, and we could put them all in under the cap, as Mr. T. Boom suggested, is an option, and that is an option. He is correct. It's a $9 million hit on top of everything else. So is it a realistic option? I don't think it's a realistic option, personally. So I'm in support of this because I think it rationalizes what we've done with previous funds. Frankly, one could look at the solid waste fund similarly. As Alderman Dean pointed out, I believe, when this legislation was first introduced for first reading before the board, but we're not debating that now. So I think we have to do something to rationalize this, and it is up to us at budget time to decide whether or not, if there is flexibility in the cap, what we do with it. And I want to emphasize that. They're separate entities. They're separate items. Yes, it can solve a problem. How the Board of Aldermen goes about allocating budget for the next budget is not the same as this. But I will say that what we do will be destroyed if we put all the expenses in the budget. Then we're done. We don't have a city at that point. So that's why I'm in favor of this.
Any other discussion? Alderman Shoneman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm opposed to it for a couple of reasons. And some of those reasons, I think, were stated adequately by the folks who spoke earlier. But to summarize my view on it, whether it's illogical or not, I think is immaterial. It's been handled one way for a long time, and making the change, the period of change, is what causes the issue here, really. Not the fact that it's done one way or another. It's done in a way that's worked. The implication, I think, at least, maybe I shouldn't say that. It's possible to read the analysis or read the legislation and come away thinking that somehow funds were being handled illegally, that there was some commingling. Without full knowledge, someone could read that and say, gee, commingling, is this meant to fix a commingling problem? And I'm glad to hear there is no commingling issue at all. The funds have been handled 100% appropriately, and I think folks at home should know that we're handling their money properly. The state is, we're meeting the state requirements for that. So if there's no commingling issue to deal with, there's no illegality here that needs to be fixed. It's just an inconsistency that, in fact, has been handled consistently from year to year to year to year, which provides a logical basis for the next year's budget. And it's when changes are attempted to be made to it that, that it causes the problem. And I think there's no illegality here that needs to be fixed. There's no need to do this other than to create that room in the spending cap. And when we talked about taxes and, the state's pushing these things down on us, and our spending cap is 1.5% or whatever the number is, and taxes go up 2.5%. I don't know that the folks at home really care what comes from the state or what goes to the state or what comes from the city or goes to the city. They look at what their taxes are. And this legislation will have the net effect of raising taxes more than they would be raised otherwise, with all things being equal. That's a fact. And I don't think that they care about the downshifting. When the state downshifts to us, I think they're saying, we need the locality, we need the city or town or whatever to help us address these issues. They clearly can't fix it, and that's why they shipped it down to us. And that has the advantage of moving the decision-making closer to the neighborhoods where all these folks live. And I think the expectation is that we're going to fix it, not just say to the folks at home, right down the street, yeah, you got to pay more. They downshifted it, we got to take more, we got to take more. I think we have to stop that spending. And this will have that effect of raising those taxes. And if we have to absorb it in some way, I think the state is saying it, I think that the folks at home expect us to do it, not by manipulating the calculation, but by fixing the issue. I'm also concerned about what Mr. T. Boom raised about this city charter issue 56-C. I think it'd be worth getting a written legal opinion on whether or not that's really an appropriate thing to do. Because if we're doing anything that violates the charter, and I'm not an expert on it, if we do anything that violates the charter, I think we need to be obviously very, very careful about that. And what was also pointed out is that the way to adjust these things is with a 2/3 vote. That's the process. We shouldn't be, from a sense of propriety, I think, we shouldn't be trying to find ways to change it, to make it look like we're staying within a spending limit, when in fact we're just making the last number different. You know, we're taking something out, so we have this headroom that becomes the cliche that we like to use, which is just an ability to spend more money. And all the money that we spend, all of it, comes from the folks at home. Whether it's shifted down from the state, spent here, it all comes from those folks at home. And regarding, well, again, I've spoke about the consistency issue, and I appreciate Mr. Griffin's answer, and I understand it to that question I asked earlier. But in the one case, when that $500,000 was used to, even though it didn't go over the cap, it was used to inflate that spend so that we could spend the more the next year. That was part of the reasoning behind that. And I think that if it's going to change it forward or retroactively, it should be done the same. Maybe paving should have been done differently too. I can see, to me, that that's an inconsistency. So let's just have a vote to override the cap or not, or change it with 2/3 vote, but not a simple majority. And regarding what's going to happen to the $9 million, yeah, I don't think the mayor's going to put in a budget that's $9 million more, but he spoke the other night at the State of the City address about wanting to make sure that the school retains its funding. Where we have a school department, it sounds like it's trying to find a way to reduce expenses in an effort to meet their all-day kindergarten goals, which I think is certainly admirable. And then the mayor said that he's trying to find a way to make sure that we can not have to make those cuts in the school department, not have to make those changes in the school department. I shouldn't say cut because the budget always goes up. This is one of those ways. And the folks in Ward 3 want us to contain our expenses and manage it. And if the process for going over is a 2/3 vote by the Board of Aldermen to make those changes, I'm going to oppose this. I think we need to honor that request. I think it's a matter of honor. Thank you.
Just, if I could, just to address a couple of those things. First of all, when the state passes costs down to the cities, they're not thinking, hey, this city's got lots of money and they can absorb it easily. They're not even thinking about that, and I'll let Alderman O'Brien emphasize on that. And as far as consistency, it's been my observation over my years on the Board of Aldermen that we strive all the time to try and make things consistent. So to have one thing consistent, one thing not consistent, that's not consistent. So the consistency issue, I think, speaks to itself. And from my opinion, and people that have talked to me, their concern is losing city services, not having enough police to protect against the drugs. And right now, the police department's not hiring the officers to go up to the limit we've authorized because they have no idea where the heck the budget's going. And fire department, you know, people are really concerned, you know, they're more concerned when they have a fire, and they want to make sure that that fire department can respond in a timely manner. Or if somebody's got a medical emergency, they want to make sure that those firemen are there to protect them. And the other thing is the school department is trying desperately to watch their funds and spending. But they have a lot of things that they spend that are totally out of their control. So, having said that, you know, the fact that this is freeing up $9 million, we still will have a budget session, and we will develop a budget. And where it falls, below or above last year's, will be determined by the budget, this budget committee, and then the full board alderman. So making the assumption that it's automatically going to go up is a little premature. Alderman
May I
O'Brien,
respond,
Alderman
please, Mr.
McCarthy.
Chairman? May I
Yes.
please respond to your comments?
Sure.
Since you responded to mine. Thank you. First off, I don't want to imply that the state thought that we had a lot of money and could do this. I think that it's very difficult for them to find the money. They know that it's difficult for us, but I think that the understanding is that the local governments are closer to the people and perhaps would be a little more responsive to the needs of the people to either override or not. Regarding the potential loss of services, that comes down to that 2/3 vote. Let's not make an assumption that a 2/3 vote can't be obtained if you want to say, let's not make an assumption that we're automatically going to spend the $9 million. When someone says, well, we're not going to override the cap, they're counting votes. They're looking around the board and they're counting the votes and they're thinking, gee, do we have enough votes for an override? And I look around the board and I say, do we have enough votes to shrink the budget at all? The answer is no. So whatever the mayor brings in is most likely what's going to pass. Because look around, we do that. There's probably not enough votes to shrink it, and maybe there's not enough votes to override it. I don't know. If it comes down to an actual loss of services, when budgets, it's clear that budgets really have been handled properly, then I think you might find the 2/3 votes. But to get anything to shrink is not going to happen. So I've said before, and I'll say it again, the only real protection taxpayers have is this spending cap. And if there's more room, I guarantee, it's just natural. There's going to be more spending than would be allowed otherwise. And that's what this is all about. I don't think that's fair. I don't think, again, that it's the right thing to do. I don't think it isn't right on every account. So I remain opposed. But thank you for your answers, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would like to thank you that you recognize that at least some of us that wear the dual hats, and proud to say my fellow Alderman LeBrun supported the measure, and I'm talking about the bill up at Concord that would have reinstated at least 15% to the pension fund that was inadvertently taken away in around 2010 and escalated downward and left us part and parcel with some of the problems that we are now seeing. And if people want to go look at the House vote that occurred on that day, the bill did pass. It is on its way to the Senate. But unfortunately, I don't know what the Senate is going to do with it. And again, I don't know what's going to happen with the magic of the governor. But it did pass the House. But the thing is, to see not completely overwhelming support from Nashua representatives is disappointing. Myself and my two-hat looking at it, because I do believe that with the spending cap, this could affect the livelihood of the quality, and that's what the city basically sells here. We don't make a product, we don't make widgets, we produce a quality product, and that's schools and education and everything else. Now, when it comes down to the spending cap, I think my colleague here thinks that this is an attack on the spending cap. I don't see this I indirectly, believe it or not, support the spending cap. It's good, it gets us as aldermen, presents us with numbers that we can look at and try to come up with a budget and live within a budget. I hear this from my wife all the time to try to stay within my personal budget. So I recognize the importance of the spending cap, but I also realize that the spending cap is over 20 years old. And it really hasn't been looked at. And now, unfortunately, with some of the cost shifting that the chairman that you have mentioned that have come down, it is, I think, prudent. We are elected by the people to come up and make good decisions. And this is not going to override the spending cap. Far from it. This is going to adjust a formulation to see maybe perhaps a past oversight. I wonder how many past budgets that we could have maybe done more, bought more textbooks in school or did something, but we lived under that kind of constraint. Right now, this might free up some money. And not to spend this money that we're saving wisely. I mean, we are responsible to the taxpayers and do it prudently and try to get the balance here. So all this is going to do is move this ordinance to another venue, to the full board, where it can be properly vetted by our colleagues. So therefore, I think it needs that sunshine, and I'm going to move it forward. Thank you.
Alderman McCarthy.
First, I categorically reject the argument that the legislature downshifts stuff to us to get it closer to the people that it affects. If that were the case, they would downshift how the money from the room and meals tax is appropriated, most of which comes from Nashua, how the money from the gas tax is appropriated, and whether or not we could accept $4 million from the federal government to do a study on rail that will not cost the taxpayers of New Hampshire 1 cent, no matter who accepts the money. Frankly, what we've got is a legislature that has simply abdicated its responsibility on paying for a number of things, tossed it to us and said, you take care of it. So that's where I believe we are with respect to things like the pension system. With regard to whether or not this meets the charter, I want to talk about the history of that. The cap passed in the '93 election, and the first budget that it impacted was the fiscal '95 budget, which would have been passed in mid-'94. And at that time, frankly, it was a brand new piece of legislation, and it should have an unambiguous, clear English meaning, which is what should be interpreted. When Ordinance 9468 was introduced, or 67, or whichever it was, I did oppose it because I was of the opinion that the language should either include or not include various parts. But our laws allow us to deal with the concept of where there is ambiguity, it's up to the people who are responsible for administering the law to figure out a way to interpret it reasonably clearly. That is subject to challenge if it's not done correctly. However, that ordinance passed less than 1 year after the cap was in place in March of 1995 and has been in place now for almost 22 years and been amended once. Never has the interpretation that the Board of Aldermen could set which accounts were out of the cap in a reasonable way been challenged or turned over. Now, I would say if what we were saying is we want to exclude the school department from the budget cap, that is contrary to the intent of the cap and is easily challenged and would be overturned. If you read the legislation, there are 8 categories of accounts that it puts into the cap, but then it excludes 5 categories from those. And there are a number of accounts that are not the standard kinds of appropriation accounts that we charge from taxes. So to me, it seems that the argument, and Mr. Tiedemann is, in his brief to the court over the challenge to the Manchester spending cap, made this point, that the cap had achieved the status of being subject to administrative gloss, which is, we've interpreted it this way for 22 years that we can, in fact, make those little changes, and that's never been challenged. And I believe now that it is, in fact, the case that this ordinance is lawful under the charter.
Alderman Siegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to concentrate directly on the wastewater fund and potential things looking forward. And it's helpful when you're the liaison to the BPW because you get an insight about some of the things we've done. Now, I know some of my fellow colleagues were there when we acquired the Burke Street property. There were two reasons why we acquired it, one of which was to potentially build a municipal garage. But the non-negotiable part was it was the only parcel of land we could expand the wastewater treatment plant. Now, we could potentially say that we were going to live with our existing capacity, but the thing that was concerning is that we may have a mandate visited upon us by the EPA to do additional water treatment, and we had no ability to expand the plant. So we have this piece of land. We are anticipating going forward, either expanding the capacity because the city grows, or we incorporate other municipalities as we're required to do because we're a regional service and we get federal funds for this. But if we have to provide for this additional treatment, and that's part of wastewater, then that additional mandated cost, a large cost I might add, would then be part of our budget. Now, might be some bonding costs. Again, we're straddling the line here, in or out. Some pieces would be in, potentially. Some pieces wouldn't be in. But one of the things that the EPA does, and they did it, and this just came up in the Board of Public Works meeting on Thursday last week, they mandated that we have to have additional operators. Like, okay, you don't have enough people here. Whether we choose to accept that or not doesn't matter. Our licensing depends on that, and we have to do that. And so I urge you to consider that wastewater is very much a system in which the costs are not controlled by us at all. We have a consent decree. Do you think any Board of Aldermen would have said, hey, let's vote to do like $60-something million worth of work? Okay, we all want clean water. It's the right thing to do. But again, this was mandated. And there's a certain amount of mandates. So we're talking about the $2 million mandate for the pension funds, that incremental additional cost. That's not the cost. That's the additional cost, because it's exploded in the last 10 years. Wastewater is another potential ticking time bomb, okay? Now, that's not okay. If we're going to straddle it, that's a problem. We're going to get blown up here by this, and I think that that's something that should be removed. I mean, think about it. I mean, if we really want to save money for the taxpayer, and of course, we all want to do the right thing, and I think we're relatively diligent. Why don't we just introduce legislation to unilaterally cut the budget 20%? Would we support that? We'd save money for the taxpayers. 20%. Somehow, that would probably not go over very well. And I'm not trying to be flip or nasty about it, but there's some threshold value in what we do. And there's some tipping point over which we create a larger problem than we solve. And I'm concerned about that. And the wastewater treatment plant, this is the next thing that's going to bite us. Because right now, we're effectively rebuilding our wastewater treatment plant. We've got a lot of expenses going in there to make sure that that's up to snuff. And that doesn't even include the stuff that was going to be mandated going forward. I urge you to consider that when pondering this bill. It goes beyond just a spending cap issue in that sense.
Alderman Sherman?
Chairman. I agree with some of the logic to move everything out of the budget. But I think the real issue of this thing, the real driver of this is the spending cap. That's what's really driving it. That's why it's appearing today and not last year, the year before that. It's the spending cap. If we could do this in some way so that last year's appropriation reflected the change, not next year's, but last year's appropriation reflected that change, I could go along with it. But the real reason for doing this is the spending cap calculation. And I think that just as much as there wouldn't be a vote to cut the budget by 20%, I don't think it's unreasonable to think that there wouldn't be 2/3 votes to make appropriate additions when the time comes. I'd like to make a motion. I don't know if I can do that. Maybe Corporation Counsel can answer for me. I'd like to make a motion that we amend this legislation to say that the effect of this $9 million coming out is reflected in the fiscal 17 number so that it doesn't affect the spending cap. And we can accomplish the logic change that I think was being advocated.
Does CFO Griffin or Corporation Counsel want to address that?
It's certainly a valid motion. Board of Aldermen could pass something that said that. Now, I think I might recommend some language before you get there, but
Okay, so the motion's on the floor. Alderman McCarthy?
Know what the motion is.
It seems to me that's one of the things the charter is absolutely unambiguous about, is how the cap number is calculated. And I guess I would believe that it would violate the charter for us to try to change that by ordinance.
Alderman O'Brien?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a little confused, just a point of order. The fact that we're discussing at this level, is it already a pending motion before us?
It would have to be an amendment.
Ends in order.
Yeah, I
Not a
made a motion for
motion.
final passage. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I made a motion for final passage, but I'm not sure what the purported amendment is. I heard some language about cap, but I don't see how that's relevant to this particular ordinance.
And I would go back to Corporation Counsel and say, if that potentially is something that we can't do in violation of the charter, then that would make that motion out of order.
I will look into it further. As I'm sitting here, I think it's a valid motion. As I said, I would like to work on exactly the wording of it, but I get the sense of what is trying to be achieved. And a motion to amend is in order when discussing the main motion.
You can either proceed with the motion, or you can rescind the motion and take it up at the full board after there's research done. It's up to you. Alderman Schoeneman.
Thank you. I would prefer to proceed with the motion, and I'd be happy to try to express it again in my non-legal language.
And it would have to be an amendment to the
It's an
current
amendment,
motion
yes.
that we're talking about.
It's an amendment to ordinance 17031. And the amendment is simply to say that the effect, and Attorney Bolton will provide the wording, that the effect of this change on the budget will occur in fiscal 17 appropriations, not in fiscal 18.
Mr. Griffin, do you have anything, comment on that, or since that number affects your,
Just so I understand what the motion is trying to accomplish, in my mind would be take the 263 million base and subtract the difference between 18 million and the debt service and the capital. That's what mechanically, that's what would happen. Which
So,
is-
I think Alderman Siegel's gonna hit on this, but I'm thinking, would that put us in violation of the cap for this year?
If you're calling on me, that's not what I was going to hit on.
All right, Alderman Siegel.
I was going to hit on the fact that the cap calculate, all of that stuff is not relevant to this particular piece of legislation. It may have implications for that, but we are debating a specific piece of legislation which has nothing to do with the cap calculation, or it has nothing to do with that implication of what we'll eventually do with whether or not this passes with the additional cap amount. And we have a budget committee and we have a budget process that deals with that. So, I mean, we can vote, we're a committee. I'm personally adamantly against that. I couldn't be more adamantly against that motion.
President McCarthy.
Yeah, I'm certainly not going to support it. I mean, it'll take 8 votes to pass the amendment, take 8 votes to pass the ordinance with the amendment, and I would point out that 8 votes at the full board is enough to constrain the budget to be based on the smaller base number when the budget comes to us, so it seems unnecessary.
Any other discussion on the amendment? Alderman Schoeneman.
Thank you. I just want to finally say that this is the essence. This calculation is the essence of this legislation. I appreciate all the logic that's required and the logic in putting it outside. I'm in favor of it. But the essence as we heard from folks speaking earlier today, and as I'm trying to point out here, it's the essence of the legislation. Thanks.
Okay, so the motion on the floor is an amendment to 017-031 to put the calculation from this, the effects of this ordinance into the physical FY17, is that what, budget? Okay, any other questions? Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. Motion fails. Alderman Shoneman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate taking the vote. I think that the vote shows that it's not about the logic. It's about the cap. And I'm glad that we've made that public statement, so the folks understand why this is here. Thank you.
I wouldn't try to make assumptions on why people are voting one way or the other. Alderman Siegel?
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say that we're not allowed to ascribe motive, okay? My motive was my motive, and I made it clear, and I'm not going to speak for anyone else, but I appreciate your sentiment. The one thing, I'm losing my train of thought now because I got so involved. Let me pass on, and I will get back to what point I was going to raise.
Alderman Shoneman?
Thanks. I'm not trying to ascribe motive to voters here, but I am just trying to point out what the legislation is about. Because as much as we talk about it being about logic, when it comes time to just addressing the logic and leaving the cap part out of it, it seems to fail here. But when it has the logic with the cap change, then it seems to be acceptable.
You ready to go back?
Back on track.
All right.
Locked in. I apologize. Thank you. It dropped a digit there. That does happen. I would point out, I mean, it was stated that, well, you know, we're just going to go and we're going to override the cap. I would point out that I had legislation before the Board of Aldermen that failed, that was merely to transfer $2.3 million in existing earmarked budget of money that would have impacted the taxpayer not at all. And that failed to get the necessary votes. Okay. That was one of the solutions that we had at that time, separate from whatever this is, okay? So if the issue is, well, we'll just go before the Board of Aldermen, no, because you know what happens is people, for whatever their reasons are, and I'm not going to ascribe motive, did not want to support that. I'm not going to say whether they're good or bad. That's their reasons. That's their vote. But that didn't happen. And I thought that to me is a little bit of a canary in a coal mine too, because ultimately, what matters is not cap knock. It's what is coming out of my pocket when I have to write a check to the city of Nashua for my real estate taxes. And that particular legislation didn't affect it one iota, and that didn't pass. So that doesn't bode well. I'll just say that, my opinion.
Alderman McCarthy, would you, no? Alderman O'Brien?
I was going to say something, but a lot is better not said, so thank you.
Okay. So the motion on the floor is for recommending final passage to the full Board of Aldermen in 017-031. Seeing no other discussion? Alderman
Just one last
Shoneman.
comment. Thank you. I'll be very brief. Just so there's no ambiguity, this legislation will result in more taxes than would be otherwise the case. Thanks.
I don't think that's a foregone conclusion, but
And I know we're playing counterpoint, and I would just say, because the budget process is in the hands of the mayor and the Board of Aldermen, separate from this piece of legislation, that while that is a possibility, as Alderman Shoneman has pointed out, that's not a necessary conclusion from passing this legislation.
okay.
Mr. Chairman, can I point something out?
Certainly, and we're always willing to listen to Corporation
Okay.
Counsel.
I know virtually the entire discussion this evening has focused on how this affects the definition of combined annual municipal budget. That aspect of this is contained on the second page in the subsections A and B of 5-145. The rest of this contains some things that I think ought to be left in regardless of what happens to A and B. For example, C in 5-145 conforms the ordinance to the city charter as it was amended a few years back to change the index that is used for the calculation. So right now, the ordinance is at odds with the city charter. So this would bring that into conformity. Our current ordinance, and now we're back up into the first section on page 1 and carried over to page 2. In section 255-61, the wastewater fund. This amends some of the language in our current ordinance, so it is exactly congruent with state law. And the most important incongruity was under our current ordinance, the way it's stated, is that the Board of Public Works and the Board of Aldermen, it says here, it says in the current ordinance, could authorize expenditures for other purposes other than the wastewater system. To do that would violate state law, so we're trying to eliminate that wording from our current ordinance. So if people are not inclined to like the combined annual budget aspect of this, that's in a couple places, but there's a little bit more going on here that maybe ought not to be thrown out with the bathwater if that's what happens. Thank you.
All set to vote? So, all those in favor of 017, 031, going to the full board with our recommendation, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Motion carries. 017, 031 is passed. I don't think there's anything we want to take from the table. General discussion. Alderman McCarthy.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment. During the public hearing, there was discussion of commingling of funds, and a point was made that the Social Security Trust Fund had been collapsed into the general fund, which is not true. The Social Security Trust Fund is alive and well. It happens to be wholly invested in debt of the United States, but its funds are not commingled with the general fund at this point in time.
Alderman O'Brien, anything? No. Alderman Schoneman, Alderman Siegel, Alderman Wiltshire. I just have a couple things. One, during the public hearing, there was discussion about the handouts. We received the handouts when the mayor and the CFO came up to speak. We did not have them in advance. They were also public knowledge because they were pieces of the budget. And if there's any issue with handing it out to the public or having a presentation in PowerPoint, please address it to the mayor or the comptroller. It was not at the control of the chair of this meeting. The other thing is, I got interrupted by one of the speakers about questions. I was going to reflect that they can ask questions of the presenters, the mayor and the CFO, and possibly Corporation Counsel, but it was not, we don't normally in a public hearing address questions to the members of the committee. I didn't get a chance to finish that statement because I was interrupted. So just wanted to make that clear. Public comment? Seeing none. Remarks by Alderman? Seeing none. No non-public. Do I hear a motion? Alderman McCarthy. The motion on the floor is to adjourn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We're adjourned at 9:08.